They tell us technology makes life faster, easier, and smarter. But then a picture of dozens of dead birds on the deck of a ship or a viral headline attributing a sudden die-off to a new 5G mast appears, and a different speed is in charge. The speed of panic. The first impulse is basic and human. Something new came. Right behind, something died. It is an overwhelming narrative momentum as an antagonist. That bow of instinct is where the story begins, but it is also where meticulous reporting has to start. Distinguish between gut impulse and factual evidence. In several well-documented viral cases, journalists and fact-checkers track those images and assertions back to other causes or unrelated events. There is no confirmed direct connection between 5G rollouts and widespread bird deaths in those cases. News outlets and environmental organizations studied the photographs and timelines and discovered either prior pictures, other explanations, or no conceivable mechanism linking the timing to a new mast. The bottom line: the sensational headlines generated attention, but they did not stand up to fact-checking. Now, what are we really discussing when someone claims fast internet is killing bird life? On the surface, the sentence combines two levels. One technological, such as quicker networks, more antennas, new frequency bands, and two biological, individual bird species, behavior, migration routes, breeding success, population trends. In order to make sense of the assertion, we need to inquire who asserted it, where and when did these occurrences take place, and what particular harm is being claimed. Immediate death, long-term health consequences, navigational disorientation, or secondary ecosystem damage through insects and vegetation. Replying to those questions involves examining science from several viewpoints. Lab studies on magnetotroption, ecological field experiment, quantifying survival and reproduction, regulatory evaluations regarding the level of exposure, and meticulous timelines for suspected mass mortality events. We cannot jump from one viral photo to a population-level inference without bridging many evidentiary intervals. Who is engaged in this argument? There are various groups advancing different narratives. On one hand, you've got citizens groups and community activists, usually spooked by abrupt changes in the environment and by the quick rollout of technologies they cannot appreciate. On the other hand, you've got telecom firms and also some regulators who point out that exposure levels are already controlled and that guidelines are designed to safeguard human health. Then there are individual scientists publishing in peer-reviewed journals and non-profit organizations, both conservation-oriented and health-oriented, that filter out new research and sometimes report studies that indicate risk. Lastly, journalists and fact-checkers serve as intermediaries, taking technical findings to the public. The contested terrain is firmly between academic evidence and public opinion. The narrative is not one of science against fear, but of a number of groups with various evidentiary requirements and varying interests. Some scientific overviews present evidence of biological effects in laboratory settings. Other governing bodies state that if human safety guidelines are followed, there is no definitive evidence of harm at population levels. Evidence of mechanisms in the lab as opposed to no definitive real-world population-level proof is the thread we have to pursue. When did this discussion become more heated? The early 2020s were critical. 5G rollouts accelerated circa 2019 to 2021, and during those same years there were a few viral reports connecting infrastructure rollouts to animal deaths. Most of those myths were discredited, but the trend had already created a narrative. New antennas, new issues. In contrast, laboratory research about how radio frequency fields affect birds' magnetic sense has continued for decades, with significant experiments demonstrating that some radio frequency exposures interfere with orientation in migratory birds in controlled circumstances. Thus, the timing is twofold: fast technological rollouts and the cumulative buildup of laboratory evidence that some frequencies impact navigation mechanisms. The central question is this: do laboratory experiments correspond to the dirty, noisy, and space-varying exposure wild bird encounter near antennas and cell towers? The data as yet are not a simple yes or no. What mechanisms do scientists hypothesize? The most advanced hypothesis concerns magnetotroption. Internal magnetic compasses are used by many migratory birds to travel long distances. The front-runner candidate for the biological sensor is a group of light-sensitive proteins known as cryptochromes in the eye of the bird. These proteins are able to create radical pairs of electrons whose spins are aligned with Earth's magnetic field, and this spin chemistry can yield directional information for animals. Experiments in the lab have established that low-intensity radio frequency fields in certain bandwidths can perturb that radical pair process and disorient birds tested in small enclosures. Results are replicable across various research teams, and they identify a credible molecular mechanism for why electromagnetic fields can under certain circumstances interfere with orientation. How strong is this evidence in reality? Controlled behavioral tests reveal reproducible results. Small radio frequency fields well below what would induce heating can confuse nocturnal migratory songbirds in laboratory conditions. Follow-up research further focused the offending frequency ranges and attempted to establish thresholds. New research demonstrated that broadband RF in the tens of megahertz range can interfere with the ability of birds to utilize their magnetic compass in laboratory tests. There are, however, key caveats. Lab exposures are exact and frequently ongoing, whereas real-world exposures are variable, multi-source, and intermittent. An experiment demonstrating compass disruption in a lab chamber does not necessarily imply population declines in wild birds. That inference requires studies conducted in the field that quantify exposure levels over landscapes, follow individual animals along migratory paths, and relate behavior and survival to real-world RF exposure. For the time being, the laboratory evidence provides a mechanism and a warning signal. It does not per se demonstrate large-scale ecological collapse. Where is the balance of mainstream expertise? Organizations that establish exposure guidelines such as ICNIRP concentrate on human health and establish limits based mainly on avoiding tissue heating and acute effects. They have maintained that if guidelines are adhered to, 5G exposures will not be harmful to people. These guidelines were not developed specifically for wildlife, and some scientists and NGOs have mentioned that the sensitivity of animals and plants may vary and environment-centered standards may be absent. Reviews and systematic overviews of the literature record both the increasing number of studies showing biological effects in plants and animals and major gaps in actual world ecological information. There is thus tension. The physics and laboratory biology indicate plausible mechanisms. Regulatory safety for people is defended, and ecological certainty regarding population level effects is not resolved. Conservationists and a few biologists in recent years have requested focused research and monitoring so that policy can be advised by real-world exposure information, not just extrapolation. Why do these uncertainties matter? Because policy decisions aren't academic. They determine where antennas go, how rapidly new frequencies come online, and whether wildlife protections are taken into account in infrastructure development. If laboratory mechanisms are valid and field exposures are adequate, specific migratory corridors or vulnerable breeding areas may be threatened. If conversely field exposures are orders of magnitude below what interferes with navigation, then the concern is unfounded and efforts should instead be directed toward more established threats such as habitat destruction, pesticides, climate change, and window collisions. Misattributing mass die-offs to new technology will also deflect attention and fund from the actual causes. Good public policy thus requires thorough targeted field studies, open monitoring, and a precautionary principle where warning signals emerge early. How do we respond to what we know now? First, take lab evidence seriously. The mechanism connecting radio frequency fields to disturbance of radical paramagnetorruption is coherent and experimentally confirmed. That renders the question scientifically urgent. Second, invest in field-grade monitoring. Outfit migratory stopovers and breeding grounds with RF measurement equipment, GPS tag birds, and conduct controlled observational studies that relate behavior and survival to measured exposure. Third, include multidisciplinary teams, physicists, psychologists, conservationists, telecom engineers, so that exposure models capture actual world deployment practices. Fourth, eschew hysterical claims in public debate. Misattribution provokes panic and can prevent rational mitigation such as preserving habitat or altering antenna siting. Lastly, regulators should decide if the human-centered guidelines are adequately protective of ecosystems or if more environmental standards are required. A number of recent assessments and expert testimony have advised just these measures. We ought to end with a clear-headed conclusion. There is a genuine scientific narrative here. Controlled experiments demonstrate radio frequency fields can impact the magnetic compass processes birds employ, and a diligent body of lab literature supports that fact. But large-scale die-offs blamed on new internet technology in the public eye have regularly collapsed under simple fact checks. Those viral stories don't hold up to timeline and forensic examination. At the population level, there is not yet conclusive peer-reviewed evidence that 5G or high-speed internet has been causing widespread bird declines. That lacuna is no reason to relax. It is a plea for improved monitoring, clearer guidelines for deployment and research with a specific aim at the actual conditions birds experience in the wild. If you'd prefer a short shopping list, require measured exposure data and proximity to key bird locations, support longitudinal studies, adopt a precautionary principle for sensitive locations, and maintain public communications factual. The mystery is not cracked, but the proper blend of policy and science will determine if the rapid internet takes the form of a villain in nature's tale or technology we use responsibly while safeguarding the birds we cohabitate with.